Hello. Oh, right, it's done it for me. Thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you, the National Secular Society, for having this event and also for inviting me to speak at it. It's a little bit of trepidation because I know that a lot of you will know a lot about Charles Bradlaugh, and a lot of you will know a lot about the origins of the NSS, and some of you will know very little. And I've got to actually try and say something of value to the people who know masses and not bore the people who don't know anything. And I've got the new statue of Bradlaugh keeping an eye over on me, so that's made me even additionally nervous. But, right, the National Secular Society was founded in 1866. That might make you imagine that, you know, a group of people with Charles Bradlaugh got round and said, oh, let's have a National Secular Society, what a good idea. And we'll set up a headquarters, and then when it begins to go right, we'll have some branches. It was actually very much the other way round. There already were masses of embryo branches of the National Secular Society when it was set up. These had all got different histories. They'd sort of come out of, you know, from the time of the French Revolution. There'd been groups of secularists who would meet. They were often also radicals or utopian socialists. They often had extra agendas. They might be Republicans, or they might not put an emphasis on that. But anyway, there were masses of these small groups in London and in the provinces. And it was not just Bradlaugh's idea of bringing them together. It was also Hollyoaks and a few other people's. And it wasn't actually initially going to necessarily be Bradlaugh who would actually be its leader. The first sort of step towards making a national secular society was to set up a London secular society. And that was done with Hollyoake as the president. Hollyoake was about 17 years older than Bradlaugh, and he had he had fame. He'd actually been imprisoned in 1842 for blasphemy, or seditious libel, as they sometimes called blasphemy then, and he was something of a hero. And it did look as if perhaps he would be, as they slowly began to get the National Secular Society idea together, that he might be its leader. He didn't become the leader. First of all, Bradlaugh took over as president of the London Secular Society in 1858, and gradually, as the National Secular Society idea grew, it became more and more obvious that it would be Bradlaugh who would be leading it. Why? Well, Bradlaugh was born in 1833, so he's sort of, yes, as I said, 17 years younger than Hollyoake. He didn't have the glory of having been imprisoned, but he did have fantastic oratorical power. At a time when actually speaking to a mass audience was important because we're talking about mass audiences sometimes. Once the National Secular Society got going with its headquarters in the Hall of Science, it seated 1,400 people without microphones. Now, if you can make your voice heard to 1,400 people, you've got a good voice. And unfortunately, Hollyoake didn't. He had a thin, weedy voice. Everybody says that. It was thin, it was weedy, it didn't reach the back of the audience. So that was actually a very, very important issue. And there are all kinds of descriptions of Bradlaugh's speaking ability. But I decided the one that I wanted to use was Annie Besant's, which is, she actually said this after, about the first time she heard Bradlaugh speak, which wasn't until 1874. But it's so much like other descriptions, but better, that I thought I'd use hers. She's come to the Hall of Science, which was the headquarters, and she heard Bradlaugh, and this is how she described it. The hall was crowded to suffocation. 1,400 people, and crowded to suffocation as well. And at the very moment announced for the lecture, a roar of cheering burst forth. A tall figure passed swiftly up the hall to the platform, and with a light bow in reply to the voluminous greeting, Charles Bradlaugh entered. I looked at him with interest, impressed and surprised. The grave, quiet, stern, strong face, the massive head, the keen eyes, the magnificent breadth and height of the forehead. Was this the man I'd heard described as a blatant agitator, an ignorant demagogue? He he began quietly and simply, tracing out the resemblances between Krishna and the Christ myths. And as he went from point to point, his voice grew in force and resonance, till it rang round the hall like a trumpet. Familiar with the subject, I could test the value of his treatment of it, and saw that his knowledge was as sound as his language was splendid. Eloquence, fire, sarcasm, pathos, passion, all in turn were bent against Christian superstition, till the great audience, carried away by the torrent of the orator's force, hung silent, breathing soft as he went on, till the silence that followed a magnificent peroration broke the spell, and a hurricane of cheers broke the tension. One of many. He obviously could command an audience. And that's actually the biggest thing that he had, I think, against Holyoake taking over. All kinds of people came to hear Bradlaugh speak. Karl Marx, who didn't like him. During the years 1857 to 58, the free thought movement under the leadership of Charles Bradlaugh developed great strength in London. This is before the National Secular Society was set up in 1866, where it had lagged since the 40s. Bradlaugh gave a regular course of Sunday afternoon lectures, not always directed against current theology, but often against political and social evils and abuses. Mrs. Marx was a regular attendant at these lectures, always taking the two eldest children, Jenny and Laura, with her. Marx also went on several occasions. Now, so that was actually from the Hall of Science, the Hall of Science that was before the big Hall of Science, a smaller Hall of Science. But certainly Bradlaugh was an event. And the Sunday evening lectures, or the Sunday daily lectures that secularist societies set up, were social occasions as well. And you've got all kinds of people going to secular lecturers that didn't necessarily believe in the entire agenda, which is a point that we'll come back to later. All secularists were radicals, but that, as you know, is a flexible term. Holyoake was a cooperator. He believed in cooperation, and that was his particular obsession. And his brother, and I just want to bring this in, Austin Holyoake isn't as famous. He was the printer for the National Secular Society until, as you see, he died quite young. Now, he was obsessed with women becoming compositors, which is actually not a bad obsession to have. He really worked, his concern was women's education and women being able to do men's work. And the National Reformer, which was not the paper of the National Secular Society, but actually Bradlaugh's paper, and we'll come to that in a minute, was actually used a lot of women compositors, and it was quite famous for doing so, because it was a profession that women got into as early as the 1850s, and that in itself is interesting. Now, Bradlaugh also had his particular radical interests. Now, all secularists shared certain radical interests. They were all in favour of an extension of the franchise. All of them were in favour of women's education. But they differed in other things. Holyoake, as I've said, for cooperation, which only mildly interested Bradlaugh. Well, of course, he was very interested in women's education, and he became, he was also believed in women having the franchise quite early on. Now, why else was Bradlaugh became the president of the new National Secular Society in 1866? And we've touched on this. He had a newspaper, the National Reformer, which was not the paper ever of the National Secular Society. Bradlaugh edited it, and it was paid for by a consortium of various people. And it was very well funded. And he managed to keep it going for 30 years. That was actually an incredible thing for any secularist person, leader, or any secularist organization to be able to do, because a weekly newspaper is expensive. And unusually, people were paid for working on it. Bradlaugh actually was given £5 a week as editor. Annie Besant got £1 a week when she started being a leader writer in 1874. So it was a very professional paper. And it was sold not just to members, it was actually sold in radical bookshops, but it was also, until W.H. Smith got the monopoly, it was actually sold at railways. So it had a force. Bradlaugh was made editor with someone else in 1860. And that didn't work out. They fell out over birth control. Bradlaugh being a supporter, Barker not. He then became joint editor with Holyoake. That didn't quite work out, but by 1863, Bradlaugh had the National Reformer completely was his, and it remained his until he died. Holyoake also had a paper, but they all seemed to come and go. He would keep a paper going for about 18 months. And having a newspaper is always useful. I recommend it. Righto. Thirdly, could I have some water? I didn't bring my water over, I am sorry. Thirdly, Bradlaugh had a very, very strong profile from the 1850s onwards as a radical leader. Now, you could say, well, Holyoake did, but not quite as much. Bradlaugh really made an impression on a now long-forgotten secularist fight, which actually Karl Marx thought at one point the riots were so strong that the English Revolution had broken out, and he wrote to his friends in Germany saying it's happening. And guess what it's happening about? It's happening about Sabbatarianism. A bill came in 1855 which actually wanted to restrict markets and wanted to restrict meetings, everything on a Sunday. Now, there were laws in place, they weren't really enforced, but this was a real push by the nonconformists who supported the new Palmerston, the new government of Palmerston, and they really, really wanted to impose a very, very strict Sabbatarianism. Now, those of you like me who are old enough to remember the English Sunday in the 1950s might wonder how you could make it stricter, but they certainly wanted to make it strict. And there was revolt. There was real revolt. There were not just demonstrations, but massive riots, and when people were arrested, the magistrates' courts were sort of attacked as well, broken windows, stones falling on the magistrates. It was all rather wonderful. And Palmerston, and Bradlaugh made himself very prominent in this, and he became very noticeable. He was noticeable at the demonstrations because he was such a big man. And after Palmerston backed down, he had no idea that there was going to be this kind of opposition. Now, the opposition was not entirely secular. It was also radical and working class, because the working classes worked 6 days a week. So if they couldn't go shopping and they couldn't enjoy themselves by going to even a meeting on a Sunday, their life would be even direr than it was. But Bradlaugh came to the fore because of the evidence he gave at a public inquiry. And after that, he really was very, very conspicuous everywhere. Lady compositors, what else? Annie Besant? We've dealt with her. Radical issues. These are two of my favorite. The Orsini bomb plot. Now, that is actually the Orsini bomb. He didn't go around. He defended someone accused. He was involved in, no, he didn't actually go and sort of set up a bomb. But that was against, I'm sure you remember, Napoleon III. And it was a big, big thing at the time. It's now sort of forgotten, but it was big at the time. And of course, Bradlaugh was very involved in the agitation for the extension of the franchise. So anyway, Bradlaugh is selected. He becomes president of the National Secular Society in 1866. So what was the National Secular Society? What then happened? Again, due to Bradlaugh's contacts, he was able to get hold of the Hall of Science in Old Street in 1868. He signed, this consortium signed, not the National Secular Society, signed a contract on a 21-year lease for the Hall of Science. It seated 800 initially, and they extended it to seat 1,400. And like the little local secular societies, it had Sunday lectures. They had them in the morning, sometimes, in the afternoon always, and in the evening. And these would also be big social events, quite often with the choir. They had a National Secular Society, started with just a small choir, and actually became really quite an event in itself. And it became actually a social event. And people would come to the National Secular Society because it actually offered a social life and friendship. I've even come across one Methodist who used to go. I found this absolutely incredible, is why would a Methodist go to the National Secular Society? And it was in some memoirs by his communist son. And this Methodist had been a footman, and he hated the aristocracy, as I suppose most footmen do. And he went to the National Secularist Society and admired Bradlaugh for his strong opposition to the aristocracy, his wanting, and for the franchise. So people might go to a National Secularist meeting to hear Bradlaugh because they liked certain aspects of his programme, not all of it. Now, obviously, if you actually joined the National Secular Society, became a member, became an activist, your interest was quite often more secular than radical. But there is also this enormous floating population. Of the actual members, what do we actually know about the members? They were generally of a particular social class. They were generally artisans and small employers. You got very, very few members who would be actual factory workers, and you didn't get any members who would, it was very rare you would get a member, well, in fact, I can't think of anyone, but maybe you can, who was of a higher social class. I mean, if you were a professional man, it was embarrassing. You couldn't possibly identify yourself with the militant secularism of the National Secular Society. And if you were working class, you had a fear. There was no real welfare system, as you know. There was the poor law, which was nobody wanted to be dependent on the poor law. But there was this secondary system of welfare if you fell on hard times, but it was administered through the churches. And so you will get people who would go to church and also go maybe on a Sunday to a National Secularist meeting because actually they weren't really believers. The Victorians had a wonderful word for them. They called them mumpers. People who would actually pretend to be religious because of the benefits that they might actually need. And some of these benefits were enormous. If you go down to St. Albans, Holborn, the list of things that they actually provided for people in the parish, including free district nursing, was formidable. So if you were of the social class where you might need some help at some point, and actually you did not want to go into the poorhouse, you didn't want to go into the workhouse, you weren't going to join the National Secular Society. And so the people who joined were of a certain particular class. They were generally better educated. Now, and though a lot of secular societies had started out with the sort of socialist ferment in the late 18th and early 19th century, socialism wasn't really of interest to National Secular Society members by about the 1850s or 1860s. Cooperation was as far as they might be interested in that direction. They were going much more in the direction of what were called personal rights, and it later became civil rights, and I think now we know as human rights. Okay, and I'll come on to him a little bit later, but in fact I think there's a good argument to saying that the National Secular Society founded the human rights movement, but we'll see whether that claim has any truth to it, or maybe it's just wild and wanton. How much time have I got left? What? Oh my goodness. Oh no, this is terrible. I'm rabbiting on. I haven't got anywhere. He hasn't been, right, okay. What did the National Secular Society do? Well, it campaigned for things. It campaigned for radical things. And mostly those things, when it was the franchise, everybody would agree with. However, Bradlaugh had one interest that was very divisive among secularists. And it seems a little bit strange to us now because I would imagine everybody in this room would side with Bradlaugh. Bradlaugh believed that birth control was a good idea because it would stop you maybe having 20 children or 10 or masses of children. Now he thought, and I'm sure most people here, everybody here thinks birth control is probably a useful idea, but it actually divided secularists. It slowly, through the 19th century, divided them for different reasons. In the early 19th century, a man called Richard Carlile, who I haven't got a picture of, though I do have a picture of his, oh yes I do, I've got a picture of his wife. Bradlaugh, when he was a young man, fell out with his family over becoming an atheist, went to live in this lady's house in a coffee shop that she ran. She was the sort of common law widow of Richard Carlisle, great secularist hero, had been in prison, so had his first wife, over blasphemy, but he was a great believer in birth control. There were a lot of opponents to him within secularism, and I'll just mention two in case you know them, Hetherington and Wooler, and they opposed the idea of birth control because they thought it would ruin the relationships between men and women. Bradlaugh, in the early 60s, tried to set up a Malthusian society, because this was very much tied up with the ideas of Malthus that poverty is caused by working class people having too many children. But obviously, if you or I had 10 or 15, we wouldn't have as much disposable income as presumably we do. So this became an issue in the 1870s again, when Bradlaugh, with Annie Besant, decided to make a test case of themselves over birth control. I think you all have heard of the fruits of philosophy. What isn't emphasized, I think, enough in the literature is how much this divided the National Secular Society. The National Secular Society operated a system of approved lecturers. They were approved lecturers, and they would go out peripatetically and speak at the different provincial societies, and they would be guaranteed by central office their expenses and a fee. This had never happened before, and it was actually partly Bradlaugh's idea, not entirely, but it was made possible, of course, by railways. You couldn't actually have a system of approved lecturers going around the country talking to different societies in the 1790s. But you could in the 1860s and the 1870s because of the railways. What Annie Besant and Bradlaugh's stand on birth control did is it split the National Secular Society. And a month before the trial, there was a national conference. The annual conference was held in Nottingham, and a lot of the approved lecturers left, including Foote, who, as you know, later came back and led the NSS. And they didn't argue on the fact that birth control would ruin the relationships between men and women. However, that argument was not dead. Darwin uses that argument, the argument that was used by Hetherington and Wooler. I bring him up because Bradlaugh asked Darwin to come and be a witness for the defense of the Fruits of Philosophy trial. Hopefully, Bradlaugh wanted him to argue that, birth control was actually necessary. But Darwin actually used the same argument that you find radicals also still sometimes used. I have not seen the book Fruits of Philosophy in question, but from notices in the newspapers, I suppose that it refers to means to prevent conception. If so far, I should be forced to express in court a very decided opinion in opposition to you and Mrs. Besant. I believe that any such practices would in time lead to unsound women and would destroy chastity, on which the family bond depends, and the weakening of this bond would be the greatest of all possible evils to mankind. So that was Darwin. And I haven't got time to tell you about Henry Fawcett, so I shall press on. Anyway, it caused an immense crisis in the NSS, immense crisis, and so many people left, which meant, of course, Bradlaugh had to find new approved lecturers. And it also slightly changed the emphasis of the NSS because of the people he chose. He chose Dr. Edward Aveling, who I'm sure you all know was a rogue. However, he was also a scientist, and he put quite an emphasis on arguing against religion on scientific grounds, rather than perhaps the earlier grounds of looking at religion and saying, look, it's illogical, it's nonsense. Look at this story, Jonah and the whale, what are you talking about? And, he would argue, obviously, against the book of Genesis. He was interested in evolution, but he was very much moved towards making the SSS much more intellectual. And the other guy that Bradlaugh found was a man called J.H. Levy, who I have discovered is not as famous as he should be. J.H. Levy also set up something called the Personal Rights Association, which civil rights and human rights. And it was a change of emphasis. So out of good, out of bad, perhaps good comes, and the National Secular Society began to move in another direction because of this split. Now, obviously, some of the people who'd split came back. Some of the splitters actually briefly set up something called the British Secular Union, I think it was, and it was headed, unbelievably, by the Marquis of, who is the guy that, Queensberry. But they had hoped, I think, that Queensberry would fund it, but he wouldn't. And it didn't get anywhere, and so people slowly did come back to the National Secular Society. Bradlaugh, of course, died, and interestingly, of course, they didn't keep the Hall of Science going much longer after Bradlaugh's death, and they also lost the National Reformer, but by that time, of course, there was the Freethinker. So that's it. That's briefly the history, the early history of the National Secular Society. A point I want to make is that secularism itself was never just what the National Secular Society did, and in many ways it had problems would have had problems if it did just want to be a secular society, because some of the issues of secularism were actually taken up by nonconformists. The nonconformists were also they were disestablishmentarians. They wanted the disestablishment of the church. They also fought the tithe. They also fought for, I can't call it secular, you can't call it secular education, but they certainly didn't want church schools involved in education. And it was quite difficult for the secularists, the NSS, to ally with the Congregationalists and the Methodists, though at times they actually had the same agenda. The secular society that came after Bradlaugh's death was different, not necessarily because of Bradlaugh's death, but because the society itself was different. Bradlaugh had succeeded. Very, very few educated people took the Bible seriously. They would continue to go to church, perhaps, because it was respectable and useful for their careers. But certainly the National Secular Society had done its job, or a large part of its job, in making secularists. And its role went in to human rights. And it's very much tied up with the idea that Aveling, funnily enough, being such a rogue, really emphasized, how do you become, without the fear of God, this was the argument, if people aren't frightened that they're going to go to hell, they'll never be good. And so the secularist argument, the philosophical and the humanist arguments started in the 1880s and have continued and will continue to this day. I would like to stand here and talk to you for about another 5 hours. I may buttonhole you about the most obscure things about Bradlaugh. I haven't talked about the oaths question, because it's known and it's another talk. There's all kinds of things about Bradlaugh that are other talks. I just wanted to give an idea of what the early National Secular Society was, and to say, well, it was vivid and it was changing and it moved. It wasn't static, and I don't believe it is today. One last thing: what is Bradlaugh's legacy itself, and what is the real fundamental thing of the National Secular Society of the 19th century, which unites it very, very much today, apart from obviously secularism itself? Bradlaugh's belief in free speech. Bradlaugh, the idea of no platforming was totally foreign to Bradlaugh's nature. He did own and control the National Reformer, but he opened its pages to his opponents. He would debate with his opponents. He wouldn't refuse to debate. And he was willing to offend, and he was willing to be offended. And I think the right to give offence, we have got rid of the blasphemy laws, but it's almost as if, the concept of blasphemy has been extended. And we're now very, very restricted in what we can say because we must not offend. Well, Bradlaugh was a great believer in offending. He maybe even is the secular patron saint of offending. And I think we must value him and his legacy. And thank you very much for allowing me to speak today.